The Detroit Lions just had one of the most bizarre drafts I've ever seen. They took a 25-year-old quarterback in the 3rd round after overdrafting a running back 12th overall, only to follow it up by taking a linebacker at 18 who was expected to go later in the 1st round or not at all. Detroit did have a ton of picks at the draft, 2 in each of the first 3 rounds to be exact. The Lions had one of those drafts that is either going to be an all-time terrible draft or amazing, and a lot of that will probably depend on Hendon Hooker. The Lions have Jared Goff, and he was very good last season, but maybe Hendon Hooker ultimately becomes the guy in the next few years. I don't know, but Hooker is coming off of an insane season at Tennessee. Hendon Hooker started the 2021 season as the backup at Tennessee to Joe Milton, but after Milton suffered an injury in the 2nd game of the season, Hooker took over the starting job and was good. The Volunteers went 7-6 in what was their first year under Josh Heupel. Hooker finished the season with 2,900 yards and 31 touchdowns to only 3 interceptions. Plus, he rushed for 600 yards and 5 touchdowns. Then last season, Hooker entered the year as the starter and was fantastic. The biggest game probably of his collegiate career came against rival Alabama. Hooker threw for 385 yards, 5 touchdowns, all of which were to Jalen Hyatt, and 1 interception. He led a late drive with the game tied at 49 to set up a game-winning 40-yard field goal by Chase McGrath to beat Alabama for the first time since 2006. The Vols ended up going 11-2 and won the Orange Bowl over Clemson. Tennessee was as high as number 1 in the AP poll, but everything fell apart, mainly due to a season-ending injury to Hendon Hooker, a torn ACL. Before he went down, Hooker played in 11 games, passing for 3,100 yards and 27 touchdowns to only 2 interceptions, adding 400 yards and 5 touchdowns rushing. He led the SEC in completion percentage and led the country in yards per attempt. Hooker was the SEC Offensive Player of the Year and finished 5th in Heisman Trophy voting despite the injury. Hendon Hooker was incredible at Tennessee. He showed a lot of poise and did everything that was asked of him perfectly. He didn't have to do anything crazy. He's a pocket passer and he excelled doing just that. I really didn't think he'd even be the starter at Tennessee, and technically he wasn't when he started. Joe Milton has some crazy talent, but I was rooting for Hendon Hooker because before he went to Tennessee, he was at Virginia Tech. I actually transferred to Virginia Tech in 2020 and just graduated. Well, Hendon Hooker was the guy when I got to Blacksburg. Hooker went to James B. Dudley High School in Greensboro, North Carolina, where he dominated. He is the school's all-time passing leader with 6,027 yards and 55 touchdowns. Hooker also rushed for 2,975 yards and 48 touchdowns. Hooker was a 4-star recruit and the number 11 dual-threat quarterback in the class. He ultimately chose to attend Virginia Tech, where he redshirted his true freshman season. Then, in 2018, he was the backup to Josh Jackson, and Hooker started the 2018 season as the backup to Ryan Willis. Well, after Willis threw 7 picks in 4 games, Hooker took over as the starter. The Hokies went 6-3 with him starting and 8-5 overall. Hooker threw for 1,500 yards and 13 touchdowns to 2 interceptions. He also rushed for 300 yards and 5 touchdowns. Virginia Tech dropped to 5-6 in 2020 as Hooker played in 8 games. He passed for 1,300 yards and 9 touchdowns to 5 interceptions, plus 600 yards and 9 touchdowns rushing. Braxton Burmeister, shockingly, started the Hokies opener. But why? Well, Hendon Hooker's last season at Virginia Tech was very complex. As a student, a lot of people were very upset that he wasn't viewed as QB1, but it all made sense later. The most interesting moment of the season was actually against Clemson, when Hendon Hooker was visibly shaking on the sideline and had to leave the game. Now, it was cold here, but not that cold. Well, it was due to a medicine in his system that had been used during a scope of his heart because he had had a health scare after he got COVID-19. Luckily, everything was okay, but looking back, his last season at Virginia Tech was quite the spectacle. Lucky for him, he got a fresh start in Knoxville and turned himself into an NFL prospect. I'll be openly rooting for Hendon Hooker and the Lions. I loved him when he was in Blacksburg, and I still do. The Lions also have James James Mitchell at tight end, who was very good at Virginia Tech and played alongside Hooker. Hendon Hooker may not have finished at Tech, but I'll be a big fan of him in the pros no matter what. Hendon Hooker made the decision to transfer from the ACC to the SEC, and it clearly paid off big, but funny enough, that was actually the case for the Lions' first pick of the draft, Jahmyr Gibbs, a running back who Detroit took 12th overall. Gibbs was a stud at Alabama last season. He rushed for 926 yards and 7 touchdowns on 151 carries, all of which were career highs. He also had a big usage in the passing game with 44 catches for 444 yards and 3 touchdowns. He ended up being named second team All-SEC. He was really explosive and put up some good numbers despite having to share the backfield with Jace McClellan. Gibbs got to show off his talent on the national stage for one of the best teams in the country, but he was a dog at Georgia Tech before he transferred to Alabama. Jahmyr Gibbs went to Dalton High School in Georgia and dominated. He led the state with 2,554 yards and 40 touchdowns as a senior. Gibbs had committed to Georgia Tech at the end of his junior year. Then he was later recruited by other programs, including Alabama, as a senior, but stuck with the Yellow Jackets as a 4-star recruit and number 8 running back in the country. Gibbs had an impressive true freshman season in Atlanta. 460 yards and 4 touchdowns rushing, and 303 yards and 3 touchdowns receiving. He was good, but he was even better as a sophomore, to the point of being named a second-team All-American. Gibbs had 746 yards and 4 touchdowns rushing, plus 465 yards and 2 touchdowns receiving. He was a beast before Alabama and was even better in Tuscaloosa. At the end of the day, it's hard to be upset at a player for leaving to play for Nick Saban. Now, I think Jahmyr Gibbs is a great player, but I am always going to be anti-taking a running back in the first round, especially at 12. Jahmyr Gibbs made the very noble choice to stay home and go to in-state Georgia Tech, and the Lions' second first-round pick, Jack Campbell, did the same. Campbell was a 3-star recruit after he had a school record 338 career tackles at Cedar Falls High School in Iowa. His true freshman year, Campbell played in 11 games and had just 5 tackles. Then he played in 5 games in 2020 and had 29 tackles, 1 sack, and 1 interception. That was the COVID-shortened season. He returned to start in 2021 and was great. Campbell had 140 tackles, a sack, and 2 picks. He was named first team All-Big Ten and decided to return to Iowa for his senior year. Ahead of the season, Campbell was named the preseason Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year, and he lived up to the hype. The Iowa defense in 2022 was dominant. They led the nation in yards per play and were top 5 in total defense and defensive efficiency. Campbell led the way with 118 tackles, second in the Big Ten, 1 sack, and 2 interceptions. Campbell ended up being a unanimous All-American and won the Buckus Award, given to the best linebacker in the country. I can't say I know too much about Campbell, but I didn't see him in many mock drafts to the first round. Lance Zierlein did have him going 27 in his final mock to the Bills, though. I do know that Iowa defense was insane, and he was a big reason for it. The Lions were very busy day 1 of the draft, taking Jahmyr Gibbs and Jack Campbell, but they had a very busy day 2. Of course, they selected Hendon Hooker in the 3rd round, but Detroit had 2 picks in the first 3 rounds. They held the 34th overall pick and used it on another Hawkeye, Sam Laporta. He's pros. Later in the 2nd, the Lions took safety Brian Branch, who was considered to be a first rounder by a lot of analysts. He dominated Alabama, and in his 3rd and final season in Tuscaloosa, Branch was a first-team All-American. Outside of Hendon Hooker in the 3rd, the Lions also took a defensive tackle, Broderick Martin. He wasn't a very sought-after recruit. Martin played his last 2 seasons at Western Kentucky, and in his 6th year in college in 2022, he had 31 tackles and 1.5 sacks. I admittedly don't know much about him. I can't say I've spent time watching the CUSA, but it also doesn't look like he has the stats to be a 3rd-round pick, not to mention that he'll be 24 this month. It's certainly a head-scratcher, but maybe it works out to perfection. The Lions had a very odd, unorthodox draft. They consistently reached for players and put absolutely no emphasis on positional value. It really does feel like we will look back on this draft in a few years, and it will either be amazing or a complete dumpster fire, and I have no idea which one it will be. I don't have a ton of faith in Hendon Hooker ever being anything more than a backup. I love Jahmyr Gibbs, but he's a running back, and he's surely not valuable enough to take at 12. 12. I've heard mixed things on Jack Campbell and Sam Laporta, and I really am intrigued by the Broderick Martin selection. I hope the Lions are good this season, and I think they have some pieces to be solid, but especially with how bad the defense was last season, drafting a likely backup quarterback and then a running back in the first round makes no sense whatsoever.